What's up, fellow travelers? Today, we're in Hoabinhian province, just southwest of Hanoi, with the capital city having the same name. Now, the largest ethnic group living here is the Hmong. And while there are a bunch of different groups that live here, we're going to focus on a slightly older group, which anthropologists have given the awesome name of the Hoabinhians. Homo sapiens, modern human types, first arrived in mainland Southeast Asia around 60,000 BCE, and quickly expanded to maritime Southeast Asia, Oceania, and East Asia from here. The Hoabinhians weren't actually the first to get here though, and the Hoabinhians took over from the Sun V culture, which was principally centered around modern-day Tanghua. While the modern city of Hoabinhian hasn't been continuously occupied, the areas around it has been for somewhere around the last 10,000 years. This is putting it close to places like Damascus, Syria, one of the first settlements founded after humans left Africa. Hoabinhian has history. While there were four main prehistoric people groups that are known to have inhabited the area, the Sanvi, Hoabinhian, Baksan, and Dabut, it's mostly the Hoabinhian genetic sequences that show up in modern populations, meaning they're the ones who stuck around the longest. There's a complex in northern Myanmar, known as the Nyathian complex, a place where particular pebble tools have been discovered, and these continue across northern Thailand until making it into northern Vietnam, showing the direct path that this people group had taken from India after about 70,000 years ago. From the sources we've found, it seems like the exact routes and timings of these people arriving in the region is still up for debate, so if anyone has better sources, we love being given corrections. Hoabinhian in Vietnamese means peace. It comes from the Sino-Vietnamese word Ho Ping, meaning, well, peace, or harmony, or calm. You know, the opposite of conflict. But it wasn't always called this. In 1886, during the French era, they named it the Hmong province, after the largest local ethnicity, a la Divide and Conquer, constantly recurring guest on the show. The 1890s saw the rise of the Khăn Vuông movement across Vietnam, the attempt to re-establish power into the hands of Vietnamese rulers instead of the French colonial ones. The renaming of this particularly rebellious region to Hoabinhian province, the province of peace, was a propagandistic move hoping to pacify the local residents that surrounded the main population center to the southwest. So by 1891, the name was officially changed. The modern city of Hoabinhian didn't exist in its current form, obviously, and the administrative capital that oversaw the province still went by Vinh Dieu, which is still the name of a town within the borders of the modern city. As this town and the ones immediately surrounding it grew after independence, it was renamed and reclassified as a city, Tang Pho, in the early 2000s. So we have a pretty positive outlook on the intellectual capacity of our viewers. We're sure you're all smart cookies. So we're pretty sure that you've put together that the ancient Hoabinhian people of the region were named after the modern monarch, not the other way around. So now let's look at where we got the term Hoabinhian. Obviously meaning of or from Hoabinhian. The name was first introduced by French archaeologist Madeleine Colani when she presented her findings from the region at the first Congress of Prehistorians of the Far East in 1932 in Hanoi. The original French was Hoabinhian and was used to describe the culture and industry that was characterized by a particular type of stone tool, or sumatrolith, that were discovered in shelters and caves around the region. Sumatroliths get their names from the now Indonesian island of Sumatra, where they were first cataloged. The term was formally adopted by the international archaeological community and anglicized as Hoabinhian, which has held on ever since. Madame Colani is actually quite an interesting character as well. Born in 1866 in Strasbourg, she first started training as a botanist and paleobotanist, before moving into archaeology. Some of you history nerds out there who may be well versed in European history leading up to the Great War that famously ended all wars, you may be thinking to yourself, Strasbourg is in Alsace-Lorraine, and that was lost by the French in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War, and the citizens were given the choice between leaving their homes and moving to territory still controlled by France, or to accept citizenship in the new German Empire by October 1872, when Colani would have been just 6 years old. And that hypothetical nerd would be right. When she would eventually leave Strasbourg for Hanoi almost 30 years later, she was a German citizen working for the French Empire, not a French subject. Anyway, she first arrived in French Indochina in 1899, first working as a teacher. She started doing archaeological research in the 1920s under the École Française d'Extrême Orient, or the French School of the Extreme East, conducting excavations across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Her discoveries were the first not just to find evidence of the Hoabinhians, but to differentiate them from the Dongsun Bronze Age culture and the Bac Sun culture of the Neolithic era, which were already known in Vietnam. She stayed in Vietnam through the World Wars and eventually died in Hanoi in 1943 during Japanese occupation. We chose to spend so much time discussing her specifically because while the EFEO was absolutely a colonial institution that focused on French knowledge production in conquered Indochina, she both chose to stay here during even the riskiest times and chose to keep the local name for her discoveries. She could have called it the Kolani culture, a common practice among European academics working outside of Europe. But she didn't. She kept the local name Hoabing, only Europeanizing it insofar as adding the yang suffix. That's pretty cool. Good on you, Madame Kolani. The Hoabinhian period was one with, well, let's say some changes afoot. The beginning of the Hoabinhian era is generally determined to be at about 14,000 years ago, while 21,000 years ago was the last glacial maximum, meaning the peak of the last ice age. So as all those glaciers started melting off the Tibetan Plateau and most of the rest of the northern hemisphere, the ocean started to rise. The land that had previously been passable was no longer so, and new routes opened up that had not been viable before. The sea level rose 120 meters, making Sundaland, the walkable stretch of forest that had connected the island of Java to mainland Southeast Asia, was now underwater. Come back for a later episode on Jakarta for more detail on that. Rising temperatures, increased intensity of monsoons, and the expansion of tropical forests were making their way up into places that had been too dry and cold for them during the glacial period. And humans, being opportunistic as humans are, followed. There are two terms, the first being long chronology, and the second being, you guessed it, the short chronology, with the first one claiming that some sites show Hoabinhian tool use alongside animal remains that date closer to 30,000 years ago, but modern radiocarbon dating make the 14,000 year mark much more likely. This short chronology is generally broken into three parts. The early Hoabinhian from 14 to 10,000 years ago, where the Sumatraliths were crudely flaked, done with limited grinding, and were always found around Pleistocene animals, giving the evidence for broad-spectrum hunting and foraging. Next is the Middle Hoabinhian, at 10 to 8,000 years ago. This is the period in which their tools were greatly refined and manufacturing technology started to take off. Bone tools were introduced alongside stone ones, and evidence starts hinting at much better understanding of plant knowledge and potentially even early signs of cultivation. Last is the Late Hoabinhian, from 8,000 to 5,000 years ago. Stone and bone tools were developed with significantly improved grinding techniques, and even regional variation. Pottery appears, and there's much better evidence for horticultural plant cultivation. Or, the transition to sedentary civilization from hunter-gatherer society. It's also important to remember that none of these dates are hard and fast. That's not how human development has really ever worked. Different trends and different technological advancements have popped up at different speeds in different areas depending on the different conditions that all of them lived under at those specific times and places. That's the whole point of historical materialism, after all. We can only really get an idea for where these people live by going off of site density, or how often we find evidence that we can tie directly back to them in a given area. The place with the most sites is definitely in northern Vietnam, particularly Hoa Binh and Thanh Hoa provinces, but also in places like Ninh Binh and Son La. Basically anywhere there are big limestone mountains, which we'll get back to shortly. There are also plenty of sites found in northern Thailand around places like Chiang Mai. The sites become less common but still distinctly Hoabinhian as they spread back west to Myanmar, south into Malaysia and Indonesia, as well as north into southern China. This is cool because it tells us that going into the end of the last ice age, there was a single culturally continuous population on the landmass between modern Yunnan and Jakarta in Indonesia, an overarching social and cultural interconnectivity that spanned over a massive area. Now, we know continents are mostly a made-up social construct, but the area would have been around 4 million square kilometers. Europe, if we don't include Russia, is about 3.8 million. The entire Indian subcontinent that makes up modern India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh is about 4.4 million. So this single cultural group managed to inhabit an area that's on scale with an entire continent. Neat. It's also really interesting to note that the distribution of these sites isn't at all random. They tend to follow the karst landscapes. We did a whole dive into how karst structures form and the geology behind them over here in our episode on Chang'an, Binh, but in the simplest sense, a couple 100 million years ago, most of Southeast Asia was underwater, and the sediment that settled on the seafloor became limestone, right? So as the tectonic plates were eventually lifted up, all this limestone started getting washed away by rain and carved into these crazy mountain structures. While very dramatic and pretty, they're also ideal for early human habitation because they act as natural shelters, both against large factors like storms and smaller factors like predators. They have springs, underground rivers, and sinkholes that provide drinking water year-round, even during the dry season. There's also just the bias for these kind of places, tucked deep into well-protected caves, to be better preserved over the years compared to sites open to the elements and all that. If you try and look up anything about the Hoabinhians, the thing that you're going to come across again and again is something called the Sumatralith. So let's get a quick overview of how we started using tools so we can understand what's going on here a little better. It's actually really interesting that we can't empirically know if we started using wooden or stone tools first. Wood tools, by their nature of being made of wood, eventually break down and are reincorporated into the environment, where rocks tend to hang around much longer. The oldest wooden tools that we know about at the moment are 430,000 years old, found in Greece, while the oldest stone tools that we know of go back about 3.3 million years, from a site in Kenya. It seems to be a general consensus that humans started using wooden tools first because it's just an easier material to work with, and if we look closely at related species like chimpanzees and orangutans, they also exhibit wood tool use. But it's also been documented that they use stone tools. But if we look outside of primates, we get crows using wooden tools, and otters being cute and cracking shit open with rocks, and beavers. Anyway, the adoption of stone tools generally went through 3 main phases. The first was figuring out that if we pick up these big heavy things, we could whack them against stuff. If you whack a potentially problematic person on the head with one, they may become more or less potentially problematic for you depending on the degree of whack. The same technique could be applied to potential barbecue participants. The next step was figuring out that if you whack a rock against another one just right, you'll chip pieces of the rock off. This gives a very sharp edge that can be even more useful for whacking against heads, cutting meat, wood, all that. The Hoabinhian Sumatraliths were what are called unifacial pebble tools. Small stones, usually rounded river stones, which had one side chipped away to create an edge. The next step was bifacial tools, which involved chipping away from both sides, like the name says. Both of these are processes known as flaking. The next leap in technology was figuring out that if you rub a softer stone against a harder one, usually with some water involved, you can grind away some of the softer stone until you get a much stronger and sharper edge than you can from flaking. This, unsurprisingly, is called edge grinding. The Hoabinhians are a textbook example of this technical transition, which makes perfect sense when we view it through the historical materialist lens. As the Ice Age was ending, the sea level rose, submerging Sundaland. The temperature also increased, and the mountain areas of Southeast Asia became increasingly forested. Alongside the transition to agrarian sedentarism, this made the production of higher quality and longer lasting stone tools necessary. In many ways, the transition from flaked stone tools to grinded ones is what marks the transition into the Neolithic era. An interesting final point on the stone tool development is the almost complete absence of hunting tools from the area. There are a few possible explanations for this. The first being that the culture as a whole preferred trapping over active hunting. The second is the almost omnipresence of bamboo in the region, which can relatively easily be sharpened enough for hunting. Bamboo was kind of an early evolutionary cheat code for technical development that much of the world didn't get the advantage of. Now, it's also kind of cool that pottery doesn't appear until the late Hoabinhian period, with the oldest examples being from around 9,000 years ago. While the pottery was primitive, the fact that it kind of just appears in the timeline at the level of technique and development it was at, and the fact that it appeared first in places like Hoabing province itself, that was close enough for at least semi-regular trade with people groups from southern China, implied that pottery as a technology wasn't a native discovery, but rather imported from the pottery-heavy cultures of South China. But the invention or adoption argument aside, the introduction of pottery is another important factor in the transition between hunter-gatherer societies to sedentary agricultural ones. Pottery vessels are heavy, fragile, and difficult to constantly carry around, meaning that it's not ideal for nomadic hunter-gatherers. Rather, the transition to an agrarian way of life makes the use of pottery much more practical. As food grown on a yearly or bi-yearly cycle has to have safe space for long-term storage between harvests. It also allowed for a diversification in cooking techniques, shifting from just roasting over an open flame and introducing the ability to practice both boiling and stewing. And if we know anything about the peoples that the Hoabinhians became, we know they liked themselves a good soup. So what were they cooking? Mostly small and medium forest mammals like deer, pigs, and porcupines, whose bones are commonly found at these sites, but also reptilian species like turtles, as well as various jungle birds. Right at the end of the Hoabinhian era was also right around the time that the red jungle fowl, a bird native across all of Southeast Asia, started getting drawn out to snack on fallen bits of food being grown in more and more concentrated areas. Now, this is a particularly cool transition point to talk about from the materialist perspective, because we know that the transition from nomadic hunter-gatherers into sedentary agrarians wouldn't have just been a process that happened overnight. People didn't just get tired of hunting and gathering shit and decide to plop down for long-term habitation on a whim. The same would have been true for the beginnings of animal husbandry. It would have been a process. Farms and ranches didn't, appear out of nowhere, right? It's not jungle fowl, egg, chicken. Because one of the biggest questions regarding the Hoabinhians is that of the horticultural question. Did they garden stuff? We know that the peoples that came right after them did, and as I've been harping on here, it wasn't just a single decision to start farming. Let's consider peanuts. Some forager didn't just pull up a plant, see the peanuts, taste one, and think, damn, the next stop is a peanut plantation. Probably thousands of different people in different locations foraged for legumes, tried planting them close along easy migratory routes, and expanded from there. How many times was a peanut dropped at the camp? And when the nomads came back to that site later, a new plant was growing. If you plant a bunch of stuff, then come back a year later and found that it's grown, take some and replant another for a year later, is that gardening? Isn't that still farming, even if you're not settled there yet? What about when cultures as large as this start planting crops, knowing that others are doing the same, so that when they migrate around an area, there's an ever-concentrating amount of food cultivation going on? The point that I'm clubbing over the head here is that this was a transition period, which likely would have taken thousands of years. It probably wasn't immediately obvious to anyone living at the time. They likely didn't even see themselves as being in a transitional era so profound, and I just think that's neat. And it just makes me even more curious. Even though there's unlikely any individual that was conscious of the changes happening, maybe somewhere? There was that one crazy uncle sitting around the campfire, ranting and raving that, oh, one day everything we eat will be planted and raised. It'll stretch as far as the eye can see. Everyone will live in the same place all the time. We'll bend the will of the forest creatures to our own. And everybody was like, sure, Uncle Unga, sure. Now, eat your jungle fowl. And we'll establish systems of distribution management that mean we won't waste 30% of our agricultural output while millions go hungry. And it's like, all right, Uncle, it's time for you to go to bed. On this channel, we tend to focus more on history than anthropology, things that happened recently enough that people wrote about it. But there are some important aspects of their culture that can be understood by the way they buried their dead. As their societies tended to follow the karst mountain structures, this meant an abundance of caves. These were lived in, but were also burial sites. Bodies would be buried inside the caves, generally in a crouching position. This may have had a cultural reason, or it may have been to save space. These were also some of the earliest signs of what we now call cemeteries, or places with ritualistic character around storing the dead. They would leave things called grave goods, stuff, basically. And since people were buried alongside some of their stuff, their tools, food offerings, and the like, this meant that they probably believed in an afterlife of some sort. Another interesting thing is that across all of mainland Southeast Asia, there is some variation in how much grave goods would be left at a burial site, but very little. This could mean a few things. First being that if they believed in an afterlife, then that afterlife wasn't restricted to anyone based on things like age or gender, and that resource distribution was relatively egalitarian. This is what Engels referred to as primitive communism, but it wasn't utopian nor scientific. It just means that they had social formations that predated things like accumulated surplus and hereditary status that would eventually come with the full transition to agricultural life. Maybe the most interesting social aspect of the Hoabinhians is shown by what is known as the Perak Man, named after the Perak River in what is now peninsular Malaysia. In 1991, at the nearby Gua Gunung Runtuh cave, an 11,000-year-old body was discovered. There were 10 others in the same burial site, but what makes this particular body important was his age. He was somewhere around 50 years old when he died. Now, it's kind of a trope that everyone died young before modern technology, but the reality is that it's about averages. Infant mortality was so high that the average age of death skewed very low before modern medicine. But if you make it past childhood, you can basically be expected to live as long as a modern human. So getting to 50 isn't that crazy by itself. The reason it's important is that the Perak man had a genetic disorder, brachycephalangia type 2. That's a hell of a word. Which meant that his left arm and leg were both severely stunted since birth. He wouldn't have been much of a hunter, or a gatherer, for that matter. What this tells us is that their community was cohesive enough not only to be able to provide enough surplus to feed and accommodate someone that wasn't actively participating in food production, but that they were emotionally and socially developed enough to choose to do so, instead of getting all Spartan about it and throwing their deformed babies off cliffs. So, while editing and trying to find actual evidence of this having happened, images of bones from a dig or something like that, we couldn't find any, and we learned of an anthropological study from 2007 by Theodoros Pitzios from the Athens Faculty of Medicine, who claimed to have conducted a dig at the base of Mount Tegete, where Spartans are rumored to have thrown their deformed babies into. While they did find lots of bodies, they claim not to have found the bodies of any infants. Though all the sites we've found referencing it are all citing the same AFP press release, and the paper itself wasn't officially published or even peer-reviewed, it seems, so it's hard to verify authenticity, but it seems safe to say that when Plutarch wrote about it, there is a definite possibility that this is an old example of Greek intercity-state propaganda. Anyway. Not only did his community care for him and keep him alive for so many decades, the higher than normal amount of grave goods that he was buried with, mostly ceremonial objects, implies that he may have even risen through the social ladder enough to become a shaman. This is a really interesting counter-narrative to the social Darwinist assumptions about survival of the fittest that's often applied to early human cultures. It's not just about who's the fittest fighter or hunter, it's about who belongs to the healthiest tribe or society. Modern-day Hoabing province is made up of over 40 ethnic groups, all of which trace partial lineage back to the Hoabinhians. The largest ethnic group in the province is the Hmong group at 64%, and King, what most people think of as the Vietnamese, make up around 28%. We've talked a lot in previous episodes about the Austroasiatic people and their language family which originated in southern China and migrated south. Hmong, Khmer, and Vietnamese are evolved from Austroasiatic. When these people migrated into Southeast Asia, they didn't push out or exterminate the Hoabinhians, rather they integrated into them. Hmong and Khmer, the largest ethnic group of Cambodia, share the most genetic similarity with the Hoabinhians, while groups like King and Thai have more genealogical input from the Austroasiatic group. This was long assumed by both archaeologists and linguists, but improvements in genetic understanding over the last decade have confirmed it. The Hoabinhians aren't some kind of lost population, they're the direct ancestors of who live here now. This is true genetically, culturally, and linguistically, this being the most true here in Hoa Binh province. The Hoabinhian era didn't just end, it gradually transitioned into the early Neolithic cultures of Southeast Asia, importing and adopting genetic, cultural, and linguistic admixtures from China and India as it developed. Well, that's going to be it from us for this week. We shoot everything ourselves, we don't use AI for images, video, music, or actual script writing. We do it all ourselves, and by ourselves, I mean Tubby. So licking that like button, pawing subscribe, leaving comments, all that algorithmically friendly shit is highly appreciated. Love you all. Bye bye!